Everyone is cheering for the A-10 Warthog return to the Strait of Hormuz. But military insiders are asking a much darker question. In a 2026 SAM-saturated airspace, is the A-10 an anti-swarm predator or just a low and slow target waiting for a Cordad 1.5 missile? Today we strip away the nostalgia and look at the brutal tactical reality of this deployment during the current Operation Epic Fury. 5 weeks into this massive campaign, the United States Air Force just deployed 18 additional Warthogs to the Middle East theater. This brings the total to 30 aircraft, representing nearly a third of the remaining fleet concentrated in one single combat zone. These are the exact airplanes scheduled for retirement that the military establishment has spent a decade trying to actively phase out. Right now, more of these heavily armored attack jets are heading directly into the war zone instead of being pulled away from the fight. We must uncover the tactical truth about why the Pentagon relies on this relic when billions in modern technology fall completely short. In the crowded waters of Hormuz, where over 150 Iranian vessels have been destroyed, a massive tactical problem has emerged. The most advanced fifth-generation stealth fighters simply cannot solve the chaotic puzzle of identifying the enemy among civilian traffic. This critical failure in visual identification is the reason why the legendary Warthog is dominating this specific maritime battlefield. Let us visualize the deadly anti-access area denial environment surrounding the Strait of Hormuz in the year 2026. The Iranian military has constructed an intricate web of coastal defense systems and sophisticated surface-to-air missiles. This SAM-saturated airspace is aggressively patrolled by advanced radar networks and the highly lethal Cordad 1.5 missile batteries. Sending a massive and unstealthy aircraft like the Warthog into this exact layered defense grid is a profound tactical gamble. Every single moment spent loitering above these heavily contested waters exponentially increases the risk of a fatal shootdown. The legendary durability of the titanium bathtub provides no guarantee of survival against a direct hit from modern shore-based SAMs. Yet, the U.S. Air Force intentionally pushes these aging attackers directly into the teeth of this extremely hostile air defense zone. To understand this incredibly dangerous deployment, we must analyze the chaotic maritime environment where the anti-swarm operations occur. The military establishment is fully aware that losing even a single airframe in this dense missile network would create a major disaster. However, the operational requirements of this specific maritime theater force the Pentagon to deploy the slow-moving Warthogs regardless. This impossible situation shows exactly why relying on legacy hardware in a modern battlefield remains a highly controversial strategy. The true complexity of anti-swarm operations reveals itself when we look closely at the chaotic surface of this vital maritime choke point. Picture the strategic waterway from 3,000 feet where thousands of civilian dhows and fishing trawlers crowd the shipping lanes. Hidden perfectly among these innocent ferries running between Bandar Abbas and Keshem Island are the deadly IRGC fast attack craft. These hostile boats sit with engines off and tarpaulins pulled tight over rocket rails while painted the same sun-bleached blue color. This specific deceptive tactic is exactly where the billion-dollar stealth technology fails against a remarkably simple asymmetrical threat. From high altitude on an advanced infrared sensor, these vessels appear as identical thermal blobs of warm engines and warm metal hulls. The highly expensive sensor suite easily detects these contacts in the water, but it completely fails to understand the tactical context. An algorithm cannot tell if a blue wooden boat carries fishing nets or an array of sophisticated anti-ship missiles waiting for a target. This identification problem forces planners to confront an unforgiving physics equation regarding the aircraft's speed and human vision. To defeat this maritime swarm, the military desperately needs an asset that can safely bridge the gap between detection and identification. There is a vital physics equation regarding angular velocity that every pilot inherently understands, but very few analysts ever explain. When a highly advanced fighter jet flies over a surface target, that specific object sweeps across the pilot field of view incredibly fast. The incredibly capable F-35 Lightning crossing the strait at 5,000 feet generates a massively high angular rate for the pilot. Those maritime targets transit the pilot visual window much too briefly for the human eye to process any meaningful contextual detail. At that supersonic speed, the aviator simply cannot rely on what is outside the canopy and must look down at the electro-optical sensors. The extremely expensive infrared targeting system effectively marks contacts on the glass display, but it fails to identify hostile intent. Among thousands of heat signatures that all look precisely the same on infrared, the sophisticated algorithm cannot spot rocket launchers. This high-tech sensor suite sees pure temperature signatures on the water surface, but it completely misses the nuanced tactical context. This specific blind spot creates a critical vulnerability for fifth-generation stealth fighters operating within this cluttered choke point. The A-10, flying at 300 knots, operates at a significantly lower angular rate, which allows the pilot to process information. Looking through a clear bubble canopy, the pilot brain runs an organic four-step process that no digital sensor can ever replicate. They scan the line of civilian vessels and contextualize whether a specific boat is holding a suspicious offset position in the water. The pilot must rapidly classify if the shapes on the deck are innocent fishing nets or hidden antenna arrays for guided munitions. Finally, they must decide if this exact contact meets the strict threshold for positive identification under the rules of engagement. This complex visual process requires massive dwell time, which is exactly the critical element that high-speed stealth fighters lack. In a chaotic theater where misidentifying a single target means an international incident, this dwell time becomes a legal requirement. A sophisticated security camera detects movement, but only the armed guard at the door can see the concealed weapon under a heavy coat. For this specific maritime mission, the slow-flying Warthog remains the only capable guard currently on duty at this dangerous choke point. The strategic deployment of the A-10 provides a totally different dimension beyond simply shooting at speedboats in the water. We must elevate this tactical discussion to recognize the intense psychological warfare against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Deploying these massive attack aircraft serves as an absolute psychological deterrence in this heavily contested A2AD environment. The sheer terror inflicted by the legendary GAU-8 Avenger cannon fundamentally alters the confidence of those aggressive boat crews. Knowing that this heavily armored machine is circling above forces the hostile elements to second-guess their aggressive maneuvers. This specific psychological weapon is arguably just as valuable as the actual physical destruction of the enemy fast attack craft. The undeniable intimidation factor complicates the adversary planning and slows down their rapid swarm operations on the dark water. However, we must aggressively question if the terrifying roar of that massive gun justifies the extreme vulnerability of the airframe. Balancing the heavy psychological impact against the very real threat of sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles is a massive challenge. The military command is heavily depending on this fear factor, while desperately hoping that no aircraft falls to a modern shore battery. We must completely flip the perspective and aggressively question the severe low and slow liability of this aging airframe. Deploying this massive flying cannon against heavily armed speedboats seems logical until you analyze the coastal threats. The Iranian military possesses highly capable shore-based SAMs that are specifically designed to obliterate slow-moving targets. Is the psychological deterrence actually worth the devastating strategic risk of losing a valuable pilot to a modern missile? Operating at 300 knots at low altitude transforms the legendary Warthog into a remarkably easy target for defenders. Brute force and heavy armor provide zero protection against advanced radar-guided munitions screaming off the hostile coastline. The titanium bathtub might stop a small caliber round, but it cannot survive a direct kinetic impact from a heavy interceptor. This specific tactical reality exposes the fatal flaw in relying on legacy close air support platforms in a modern naval fight. The military establishment is essentially gambling with human lives by deploying outdated airframes into a meat grinder environment. This high-stakes geopolitical power play could instantly collapse if a burning A-10 is broadcasted on international television. If we remove the human pilot entirely, we are left with unmanned platforms like the MQ-9 Reaper drone for this complex maritime mission. This specific drone offers over 14 hours of endurance, which easily solves the persistent surveillance problem over the choke point. However, the unmanned Reaper possesses absolutely no titanium armor and lacks the crucial redundant flight controls for true survivability. A single heavy machine gun round from a hostile speedboat can instantly destroy this fragile $32 million flying sensor node. Furthermore, the remote operator sits in a ground station thousands of miles away, viewing the battlefield through a delayed satellite feed. This massive communication delay makes it physically impossible to execute the rapid visual identification required in chaotic situations. The drone operator is effectively looking at the combat zone through a narrow straw, while the A-10 aviator looks through a wide windshield. Staring at digital pixels on a distant monitor can never replace the raw situational awareness generated by a human pilot in the cockpit. Unmanned systems simply cannot survive the dense defensive networks while simultaneously executing delicate visual classification protocols. The Collaborative Combat Aircraft program promises to solve this visual identification issue using artificial intelligence. Advanced prototypes like the YFQ-42A and the YFQ-44A are designed as autonomous wingmen, costing tens of millions of dollars. However, these expensive autonomous systems simply cannot achieve positive identification in severely cluttered maritime environments. Military assessments clearly describe the current visual recognition capabilities of artificial intelligence as incredibly brittle. This highly advanced software completely fails when it encounters random objects that exist strictly outside its limited training data. The digital targeting algorithm easily breaks down when hostile contacts are partially hidden or actively crowded by similar vessels. An artificial intelligence program does not run the organic four-step process of scanning and deciding, but it merely runs pattern match. When the digital pattern is a fast attack craft painted to look exactly like an innocent fishing boat, the matching algorithm shatters. With initial operating capability projected for the year 2028 at the earliest, the technological gap in maritime identification is now. The tactical reality forces us to critically evaluate platforms like the MH-60R Seahawk or the highly capable A-29 Super Tucano. These specific alternative airframes are arguably much better suited for conducting dangerous anti-swarm operations over the water. The heavily armored Warthog costs an astonishing $20,000 per flight hour while burning massive amounts of jet fuel. Operating a nimble turboprop like the Super Tucano costs a tiny fraction of that amount and provides significantly better endurance. Meanwhile, the versatile Seahawk helicopter utilizes excellent onboard radar to actively track and eliminate these hostile speedboats. Armed with precision Hellfire missiles, the Seahawk can methodically destroy maritime threats while hovering safely outside gun range. When comparing the massive operational costs and specific tactical benefits, it becomes extremely difficult to justify the legacy jet. Deploying this expensive Cold War relic instead of these cheaper alternatives proves this is a high-stakes geopolitical power play. The taxpayers are effectively funding an incredibly inefficient solution when dedicated maritime assets exist within the inventory. This entire operation reveals that the actual goal is projecting terrifying optical dominance rather than simply saving combat funds. For decades, the United States Air Force optimized its entire doctrine for a single vision of beyond visual range combat. The military establishment built advanced fighters with the belief that aviators should never visually see their enemies. The aging Warthog completely rejected this modern principle by forcing pilots to fly dangerously low and use human vision. However, this chaotic maritime operation proves that hostile elements hiding among civilians render remote sensors useless. The Pentagon desperately relies on this Cold War relic because the futuristic doctrine they prepared for is entirely flawed. They aggressively surge these outdated planes into the combat zone simply because brutal battlefield physics demands them. This massive collision between theoretical warfare and chaotic reality forces commanders to deploy the plane they abandoned. Their billion-dollar vision of pristine warfare completely shatters when fighting inside this extremely crowded choke point. The legendary A-10 brings unmatched psychological terror to the battlefield, but the math in a modern A2AD environment is unforgiving. Is traditional close air support totally dead when operating inside a modern naval choke point heavily defended by advanced missiles? The physics of visual identification and angular velocity will constantly dictate tactics until new drone technology truly catches up. We desperately want to hear from the brilliant tactical minds actively analyzing this specific conflict down in the comments section below. If a major hot conflict abruptly erupts in Hormuz tomorrow, does raw brute force actually beat modern shore-based anti-aircraft missiles? Or should commanders establish a different strategy and hand this dangerous anti-swarm mission over to Seahawks and Super Tucanos? Drop your detailed threat assessment below, and make sure to subscribe because the next geopolitical crisis will require sharp analysis.